You're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast, and this is the top 5 worst vice presidents.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential lore. 3, who will talk like me? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, let's go down the gun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
And I am Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
Last time we did a top 5, it was the top 5 best vice presidents. This time, we're going with the worst. The other side of the coin.
Looking at vice as a vice.
Yep. A lot of vice presidents didn't really do much of anything at all. Some did worse than that.
Indeed. Those are the folks that we're going to look at here today.
A lot of vice presidents left no mark, some leaving a mark for the wrong reasons.
Indeed. That is what we'll examine today as we explore the top 5 worst vice presidents.
Number 5.
Andrew Johnson.
Well, we've talked about Andrew Johnson's vice presidency a couple times on his episode and on the top 5 drunkest presidents. So
Indeed.
he will never live this down, certainly not on this podcast.
No, indeed.
Andrew Johnson, he was the only Democratic senator from a seceding state to remain loyal to the Union, so he was chosen as Lincoln's vice presidential running mate in 1864 to broaden the ticket's appeal to Northern war Democrats, and his short vice presidency began on a very ignominious note.
Indeed it did. On Inauguration Day, Johnson downs several glasses of whiskey on his way to be sworn in as vice president. He had been in some poor health and was perhaps hungover from drinking the night before. In the Senate chamber, in the presence of Congress, the Supreme Court, the Cabinet, President Lincoln, and foreign diplomats, Johnson rose to speak, and it was immediately apparent that he was blind drunk. He was supposed to speak for about 5 minutes, but rambled on incoherently for 15 minutes, saying, quote, "Your president is a plebeian. I am a plebeian. I glory in it. Tennessee has never gone out of the Union. I'm going to talk 2 minutes and a half on that point. I want you to hear me. Tennessee always was loyal. We all derive our power from the people." He proceeded to call out each cabinet secretary by name to say they derived their power from the people, but he forgot one of their names and had to stop and ask, "Who is Secretary of the Navy?" Someone responded it was Gideon Welles. Johnson responded, "You, Mr. Welles, Secretary of the Navy, get your power from the people." And so on and so forth. When taking the oath of office, Johnson picked up the Bible and said, quote, "I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States."
His speech was described by witnesses as, quote, "a rambling and strange harangue that was listened to with pain and mortification by all his friends." It was said, quote, "the man is certainly deranged, either drunk or crazy." He was called a drunken boor and a low sot. Future President Rutherford B. Hayes wrote to his wife, quote, "It was lucky you did not come to the inauguration. The bad weather and Andy Johnson's disgraceful drunkenness spoiled it."
That's right.
Perhaps the most visible and infamous act by a vice president to bring shame upon the vice presidency.
Absolutely. The New York World newspaper wrote, quote, "The drunken and beastly Caligula, the most profligate of all the Roman emperors, raised his horse to the dignity of consul, an office that in former times had been filled by the greatest warriors and statesmen of the Republic. The consulship was scarcely more disgraced by that scandalous transaction than is our vice presidency by the late election. This office has been adorned in better days by the talents and accomplishments of Adams and Jefferson, Clinton and Gary, Calhoun and Van Buren. And now to see it filled with this insolent, drunken brute, in comparison with whom even Caligula's horse was respectable. And to think that only one frail human life stands between this insolent, clownish drunkard and the presidency. May God bless and spare Abraham Lincoln. Should this Andrew Johnson become his successor, the decline and fall of the American Republic would smell as rank in history as that of the Roman Empire under such atrocious monsters in human shape as Nero and Caligula.
Ouch.
Damn.
Not getting good press in his brief vice presidency was Andrew Johnson. Some senators considered introducing a resolution calling for him to resign. Lincoln said to a concerned cabinet member, quote, "I've known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." It's not getting off to on a good foot as the vice president if the president has to go around promising that you're not a drunkard.
Yeah.
This incident would haunt Johnson for the rest of his career. His political opponents would thereafter regularly accuse him of drunkenness. Anytime anything goes wrong, he must be drunk. Following this disastrous inaugural appearance, Johnson hid from public view to avoid ridicule and considered moving his family back to Tennessee.
But when Richmond fell to the Union Army, he made public appearances calling for leading traitors to be executed. His only contributions to public policy during his short vice presidency were to contravene the spirit of reconciliation Lincoln sought to promote. On April 14th, Johnson saw Lincoln for the first time since the inauguration when he visited the White House and urged Lincoln against being lenient with the rebels. The following morning, Johnson would be sworn in as president after Lincoln succumbed to an assassin's bullet, and the unthinkable contingency feared by the New York world became reality.
And Vice President Johnson becomes President Johnson.
That's it. Not a good look for the vice president there.
Well, speaking of not good looks for the vice president.
That's it. We're going to move on to the top 5 worst vice presidents.
Number 4.
John C. Breckinridge.
Yep. Breckinridge worked as a lawyer. He fought in the Mexican-American War, then entered the Kentucky state legislature, went on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. At the 1856 Democratic Convention, he first supported the renomination of President Franklin Pierce, then, after Pierce's withdrawal, backed Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. But when James Buchanan won the nomination, Breckinridge was chosen as his vice presidential running mate as a consolation to disappointed Pierce and Douglas supporters. As vice president, Breckinridge would have a strained relationship with Buchanan, who resented Breckinridge's support for his rivals at the convention. Buchanan rarely met with Breckinridge and rarely consulted him on patronage appointments.
That's right. Breckinridge's actions as vice president would contribute to the splitting of the Democratic Party and soon thereafter of the Union itself. He supported the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution for Kansas, which alienated Northern Democrats, especially his former friend Stephen Douglas. He expressed support for the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which held that even free African Americans had no rights and could not be citizens, and that Congress had no power to prevent the expansion of slavery into federal territories. He also argued that radical abolitionist John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry proved that the Republican Party would insist on, quote, Negro equality or violence, and that resistance would eventually be necessary, this despite the fact that most Republicans distanced themselves from the raid, with Lincoln calling it, quote, insane.
Well, Breckinridge, he believed in the right of secession, and he urged his fellow Kentuckians against seceding in a way that bothered even some of his own relatives. He was a guy who was going out of his way to say, don't secede, when no one was actually considering seceding.
Yeah.
He supported a federal slave code that would protect property rights in slaves regardless of local laws. So much for states' rights.
Yep.
In 1860, Southern delegates walked out of the Democratic Convention in protest after the convention refused to put the federal slave code in the party platform.
Yep, and a second convention boycotted by Southern delegates would nominate Stephen Douglas for president. A rival convention of Southern delegates nominated Breckinridge, who accepted the nomination and thus split the Democratic Party. Douglas complained that, quote, there is not a disunionist in America who is not a Breckinridge man. Southern Unionists nominated John Bell on a constitutional union ticket, and Bell would win Breckinridge's home state of Kentucky. Breckinridge would go on to finish third in the popular vote behind Lincoln and Douglas, and second in the Electoral College.
Well, when Southern states began seceding after Lincoln's election, the still-sitting Vice President Breckinridge endorsed the Crittenden Compromise, which proposed constitutional amendments to guarantee slavery's legality below the Missouri Compromise line. When his term as vice president expired on March 4th, 1861, Breckinridge took a seat in the Senate, to which he had been elected a couple years prior. And though he had spoken against the breakup of the Union, his actions after leaving the vice presidency show his true colors.
Indeed. Following the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, Breckinridge attended a Kentucky convention and advocated secession. The convention was deadlocked on that question and recommended neutrality. In special elections held in June 1861, pro-Unionists won 9 of 10 Kentucky House seats, and Breckinridge stated that if Kentucky sided with the Union over the Confederacy, he would leave the Senate. So much for states' rights.
Yep. Breckinridge fled from Union-occupied Kentucky into Confederate-occupied Kentucky and enlisted in the Confederate Army without resigning from the Senate. The Senate voted to expel him from its membership, and he was indicted for treason. He was the second former vice president to be indicted for treason. Spoiler alert for later in the episode. Breckinridge went on to serve as a Confederate general and as Confederate War Secretary. After the war, he fled to Canada until he was granted amnesty in 1869. He refused to re-enter politics and died in 1875.
Oof.
Yeah, so this is a guy, it's not like the breakup of the Union can be blamed on John C. Breckinridge, but he's just one of all these guys who were making it happen. Despite giving lip service to the Union, what he really was like the guy holding the gun to your head saying, give us what we want,
Yeah.
or else. Because he's a guy who, they talk about states' rights, but he's from Kentucky, and Kentucky supported Union candidates and didn't secede, and he's like, well, I'm seceding anyway.
Yeah.
He's like the opposite of Robert E. Lee.
Hmm.
Robert E. Lee wasn't thrilled about secession, but he felt he couldn't go against his state of Virginia. Breckinridge, the opposite. You're not seceding? Well, I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah. That's something. And
No.
that's going to lead us to the top 5 worst vice presidents.
Number 3.
Spiro Agnew.
Agnew served as Baltimore County Executive and was governor of Maryland when Richard Nixon chose him as his vice presidential running mate in 1968. During the campaign, Agnew referred to Polish Americans as Polacks and to one Japanese American reporter as the Fat Jap. And, well, as a former vice president himself, Richard Nixon, of course, was on our best vice presidents list. Nixon imagined a substantial role for Agnew. Nixon is sympathetic to the vice president, and Agnew initially has an office in the West Wing, a vice presidential first, but things didn't really play out the way they planned.
That's right. Nixon was often annoyed when Agnew bothered him with matters he considered trivial, and the vice president was excluded from the president's inner circle of advisors. After one cabinet meeting, Nixon had Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman tell Agnew to keep his foreign policy opinions to himself. Agnew's West Wing office was given away, and he was moved to the old executive office building.
As Walter Mondale put it, if you're going to be in the executive office building, you might as well be in Baltimore.
That's right.
That's where Agnew came from to begin with. Well, he's not going to be in the policy-making circle of the administration, but he's going to get a new role as the administration's attack dog against Democrats and media critics, a role in which he lampooned the, quote, pusillanimous pussyfooting of the liberals. Well, following the Kent State shootings, Nixon had to order Agnew to tone down his attacks on student protesters. In 1972, Nixon considered replacing Agnew on the ticket and only opted to retain him at the last minute. Agnew campaigned aggressively and tried to position himself as the front-runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. However, Agnew's second term as vice president would spell the end of his political career.
That's it. In 1972, George Beall, the U.S. Attorney for Maryland, opened an investigation into government corruption in Baltimore County, targeting current office holders. Beall initially discounted rumors that Agnew may be implicated in wrongdoing until Lester Matz, owner of an engineering firm targeted by the investigation, admitted to paying 5% kickbacks to Agnew for government contracts received when Agnew was county executive and governor. Matz said that the payments continued while Agnew was vice president, and he was prepared to testify that he had met Agnew at the White House and given him $10,000 cash.
Yikes.
Another Maryland government official had documentation of corrupt payments he participated in with Agnew.
Well, Agnew claimed that the payments were legal campaign contributions and proclaimed his innocence in a press conference, calling the accusations, quote, damned lies. He also assured Nixon that he had done nothing wrong. By this time, the Watergate scandal was heating up, and newspapers were filled with developments in both scandals. And despite his continued claims of innocence, Agnew met with prosecutors and agreed to plead no contest to one felony charge of tax evasion, for which he would get 3 years probation and pay a $10,000 fine.
That's right. On October 10th, 1973, the same day that he entered his plea, Agnew resigned the vice presidency. He was the second vice president to resign after John C. Calhoun did so in 1832, a few months before the expiration of his term, to take a seat in the Senate. In 1980, Agnew published a memoir called Go Quietly or Else, in which he insisted on his total innocence and claimed that he resigned only after White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig demanded his resignation with an implied threat that he would be assassinated if he refused. The claim has been called absurd, and Agnew's own lawyer testified that Agnew admitted taking bribes. In 1981, a Maryland judge ordered Agnew to repay the state almost $250,000 for bribes he received, plus interest.
Not a great end for Agnew's vice presidency.
No, indeed, and I believe we've talked about before what would have happened if the Watergate stuff had gone a little bit faster and Nixon resigned before Agnew.
Yeah. Well,
what would that have meant?
Who was Speaker at the House at the time? They might have the vice president and president forced to resign. Or you'd think if Agnew had become president and then it looked like he was going to go down as well, that they would force him to nominate Gerald Ford or someone else to be vice president and take over.
That's it.
Well,
fortunately, it didn't come to that.
In any event, we got Ford replacing Agnew and then Nixon.
That's it. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 worst vice presidents.
Number 2.
Aaron Burr.
Parlaying his status as a Revolutionary War hero into a U.S. Senate seat, Aaron Burr helped organize the Democratic-Republican Party in New York, and in 1800 he organized the New York State Assembly campaign that swept New York City for the Republicans, giving them a majority in the state legislature and therefore control of New York's electoral votes, which would make the decisive difference in the upcoming presidential election. In consideration of his services, Burr was named as Jefferson's vice presidential running mate.
That's right, but as our listeners know, before the 12th Amendment, the vice president was not separately elected. Electors of the Electoral College each cast 2 votes, and whoever had the most votes would be president, and second most, vice president. The Republican ticket beat incumbent President John Adams, but, having maintained perfect party unity, Jefferson and Burr tied for first place with 73 electoral votes each.
Yep, and the House of Representatives, with its lame duck Federalist majority, had to break the tie. Burr faced intense pressure from his own party to declare that he would not accept the presidency, but he refused to do so. Many Federalists felt that the more moderate Burr would be better than Jefferson, even though Alexander Hamilton advised that Burr was a dangerous man who could not be trusted with power. The House deadlocked for 35 consecutive ballots, with 8 state delegations voting for Jefferson and 6 for Burr, with 2 divided. A majority of 9 out of 16 states was required. Then, on the 36th ballot, some Burr voters abstained and Jefferson won. Neither man openly campaigned for support in the House process, but Jefferson and Burr partisans spent decades afterward accusing one another of scheming for the presidency.
That's it. Now, the immediate result was Jefferson no longer trusts Burr, and as vice president, he was persona non grata in the new administration. Jefferson openly snubbed Burr's friends for appointments, and New York patronage went to the Clinton faction. Burr continued to hold out hope of receiving favor from Jefferson, and in 1802, the Senate tied on a vote to repeal the Midnight Judges Act, and Burr broke the tie in favor of repeal. It was said at the time that if Burr had repudiated Jefferson and voted against the repeal, he would have instantly become the Federalist candidate for president in 1804.
Meanwhile, to prevent another fiasco like the 1800 election, Congress proposed the 12th Amendment, which provided that the president and vice president be separately elected. It was ratified by the states, taking effect in time for the 1804 election, and by that time, it was clear that New York Governor George Clinton would be replacing Burr as Jefferson's running mate. So what's Burr going to do? He openly breaks with Jefferson and runs for the now open seat of governor of New York. That election was held in April 1804, and Burr lost to the Clinton faction's candidate. He blamed his loss in part on Alexander Hamilton and challenged Hamilton to a duel over alleged comments referenced in a newspaper. On July 11th, 1804, the sitting vice president shot and killed his fellow founding father.
That's right. Though dueling was rarely, if ever, prosecuted, Burr was indicted for murder in New Jersey and New York. He fled to his daughter's South Carolina home, but returned to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1805, where he presided over the Senate impeachment trial of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. He was said to have conducted the proceedings with, quote, the impartiality of an angel, but with the rigor of a devil. Chase was acquitted, and Burr's efforts helped end the Republican Party's push to break the power of the Federalist judiciary through impeachments. At the expiration of his term as vice president, Burr gave a farewell address in the Senate, which brought some senators to tears.
Maybe a little bit of good accomplishments for Burr there at the end. And his clash with President Jefferson isn't really why he's on the list of worst vice presidents. Given the way vice presidents were chosen at the time, they didn't necessarily owe the president their loyalty. And if loyalty to the president was the mark of a good vice president, then Vice President Thomas Jefferson would probably be on this list of worst vice presidents. Burr is on the list, really, after he lost the 1804 governor's race. He pretty much goes off the deep end.
Yeah.
Not only did he go out of his way to force a reckless and destructive duel with Hamilton, but he was still the sitting vice president when he began plotting the enterprise that would result in him being charged with treason in 1807.
That's just it. The so-called Burr Conspiracy was allegedly a plot to raise a private army to conquer Spanish territory in Texas and Mexico, and perhaps even induce the western states to secede from the Union and form a Western Empire with Burr as emperor. While he was vice president, he met with the British ambassador to solicit British aid for the expedition. He also met with General James Wilkinson, a co-conspirator who happened to be the top general in the U.S. Army, and also, secretly, a Spanish spy. The expedition did not come together as quickly as Burr hoped. Rumors started to get around, and Wilkinson betrayed Burr and raised the alarm, leading to his arrest on charges of treason. Luckily for Burr, his trial was presided over by one of Jefferson's arch-enemies, Chief Justice John Marshall, who defined treason narrowly, and Burr was acquitted for lack of evidence.
That's right.
Pretty wild.
Indeed. one of our early history's most interesting episodes.
Absolutely.
But a
Well.
vice president who was arguably engaging in treason while he was still in office.
Yep. And what could be worse than that? Well, let's find out as we explore the top 5 worst vice presidents.
Number 1.
John C. Calhoun.
Well, after representing South Carolina in the House and serving as War Secretary under President Monroe, John C. Calhoun sought the vice presidency in 1824 when his ambitions for the presidency failed to attract support. When none of the 4 presidential candidates won a majority of the Electoral College, the House chose John Quincy Adams over top vote-getter Andrew Jackson, and Adams named House Speaker Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Vice President Calhoun was troubled by the so-called corrupt bargain, and after his friends denounced it on the Senate floor, President Adams published a letter written under a pseudonym accusing Calhoun of dereliction of duty. Calhoun responded under a pseudonym that it would be tyrannical for a president to suppress freedom of debate in Congress. A vice president and his president trading pseudonymous barbs.
Indeed. As presiding officer of the Senate, Calhoun cast tie-breaking votes against Adams' agenda, including internal improvements in tariff bills, which Calhoun saw as a threat to states' rights. In 1826, Calhoun wrote to Andrew Jackson and expressed support for Jackson's campaign in unseating Adams in the next election. Jackson accepted Calhoun as his running mate, and their ticket won the 1828 election. Calhoun became the second vice president after George Clinton to serve under 2 different presidents.
Yes, well, Clinton served under 2 very friendly presidents, going from Jefferson to his chosen successor, Madison.
That's it.
Calhoun serving under 2 presidents who hated each other. Calhoun turning on John Quincy Adams to join Andrew Jackson, who I'm sure, of course, would become his great friend. Well,
Not so fast.
Calhoun's relations with Jackson soured immediately when Calhoun's wife, Floride, organized the cabinet wives to shun Peggy Eaton, wife of the new War Secretary John Eaton, over rumors that Peggy and John had carried on an adulterous affair while Peggy's first husband was still alive. Jackson sided with the Eatons, and the so-called Petticoat Affair sowed bad blood that consumed the first 2 years of Jackson's term, ending only in 1831 after a wholesale turnover of the cabinet. Calhoun did nothing to stop his wife's campaign against Peggy Eaton, and some historians consider the affair as Calhoun's effort to politically destroy John Eaton, who favored the high tariffs Calhoun despised, and was an ally of Martin Van Buren, whom Calhoun saw as his chief rival to succeed Jackson as president.
That's right. Calhoun denounced the 1828 Tariff of Abominations, arguing in favor of a state's right to nullify federal laws it deemed unconstitutional, and he also argued for a state's right to secede from the Union as a last resort to protect its rights. At the 1830 Jefferson Day dinner, Jackson gave the famous toast, quote, "Our federal Union, it must be preserved," to which Calhoun gave the infamous response, quote, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burden of the Union."
Well, also in 1830, correspondence came to light showing that while serving as Secretary of War in 1818, Calhoun had favored censuring Jackson for his unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida. This revelation further enraged Jackson against Calhoun. In 1832, Jackson's nomination of Van Buren to serve as minister to Britain came down to a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. Calhoun voted against Van Buren's confirmation, hoping that it would end Van Buren's career. Instead, the move backfired on Calhoun and generated sympathy for Van Buren, who was chosen to replace Calhoun as Jackson's running mate in the 1832 election.
That's it. In late November 1832, after the Jackson-Van Buren ticket won the election, Calhoun helped orchestrate the South Carolina legislature's vote to nullify the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832. The action was backed by an implied threat to secede from the Union if the nullification was not acquiesced in, and there was uncertainty whether other Southern states might join South Carolina's stand. President Jackson sent warships to Charleston Harbor and threatened to hang Calhoun or any man who supported secession.
Meanwhile, South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne resigned to become governor of South Carolina, and Calhoun was elected to the Senate. He resigned the vice presidency on December 29, 1832, with just over 2 months remaining on his term, and joined the Senate. There, he continued to endorse nullification while working with Senator Henry Clay on a compromise tariff. Congress passed the compromise tariff on the same day as a bill authorizing Jackson to use force against South Carolina if necessary to enforce federal law. South Carolina purported to nullify the force bill. James Parton, an early Jackson biographer, squarely blamed Calhoun for the nullification crisis. Quote, Calhoun began it, Calhoun continued it, Calhoun stopped it.
There you have it.
John C. Calhoun, a very infamous tenure as vice president.
That's for sure. What a pithy move against MVB.
So he got eighth.
Nullification is going to earn him his number one spot on our list.
Right. That's the, precursor to 1860 secession, the intellectual foundations of secession.
That's right.
Most openly promoted by John C. Calhoun in this episode.
Absolutely.
If only James Buchanan had taken a page from President Jackson's book.
Well, there's been quite a few bad vice presidents, so we got some honorable mentions here.
That's right.
We're going to start with Charles Dawes. Following World War I, Dawes had won the Nobel Peace Prize for devising the Dawes Plan to loan Germany the money necessary to pay its post-war reparations. He was nominated for vice president in 1924 after 2 of President Coolidge's preferred candidates said no. Dawes began his vice presidency by flouting tradition. The vice president usually gave a very brief inaugural address, but Dawes launched into a lengthy diatribe criticizing the Senate's rules, which angered senators and upstaged Coolidge's inaugural address. Soon thereafter, Dawes was responsible for one of the most embarrassing blunders in vice presidential history. The Senate was debating Coolidge's nomination of Charles Warren for Attorney General, and Dawes, assured that no vote was imminent, went back to his hotel to take a nap. However, several scheduled speakers declined to speak, and a vote was held promptly, resulting in a tie that Dawes could have broken in favor of the president's nominee. Republicans got word to Dawes, who tried to rush back to the Capitol, but before he got there, one Democratic senator changed his vote, and the nomination was defeated. It was the first time a cabinet nomination had been rejected by the Senate in over 60 years. Dawes would continue to rub President Coolidge the wrong way, working vigorously to secure the passage of a farm relief bill that Coolidge vetoed twice. Coolidge would not mention Dawes' name in his memoirs.
Another honorable mention, we've got Thomas Marshall. As vice president, former Indiana Governor Thomas Marshall had an icy relationship with President Woodrow Wilson, who differed with Marshall on many issues, refused to take his advice, and broke tradition by meeting directly with senators rather than using the vice president as an intermediary. Wilson retained Marshall on the ticket in 1916 as a show of party unity, but their relationship had not improved by October 1919 when Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke with over a year and a half left on his term. Marshall was denied access to Wilson and was not given official word on his condition. Wilson's closest advisors and his wife, Edith, who despised Marshall in part due to his uncouth sense of humor, controlled access to the secluded president and essentially exercised presidential power on his behalf. Some congressional leaders and cabinet officers, led by Secretary of State Robert Lansing, urged Marshall to assume presidential powers as acting president. Marshall refused, stating that he would only become acting president if asked by Wilson or if requested by a joint resolution of Congress. Some congressmen worked on such a joint resolution, but opponents of Wilson's proposed League of Nations treaty scuttled it because they felt it would be easier to defeat the treaty with an incapacitated Wilson as president, and they were right. This uncertain state of affairs continued until Wilson's term expired. Marshall met with Wilson on the last day of his presidency after not having seen him in person a single time since before his stroke.
Wow. That is something.
Wow.
And speaking of something, we got Dan Quayle. Quayle's two immediate predecessors were number 1 and number 2 on our list of the top 5 best vice presidents. Walter Mondale substantially expanded the vice president's role, and George H.W. Bush took the ball and ran with it. As president, Bush was prepared to have his own vice president continue the trend. The young Indiana senator failed to fill the shoes of those who came before him, and instead became a national punchline. When Quayle compared himself to JFK during the vice presidential debate, his Democratic opponent Lloyd Bentsen landed a legendary knockout punch. Quote, "Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy."
Ouch.
Democrats campaigned against Bush with the slogan, quote, "Quayle, just a heartbeat away." In 1992, following the Rodney King riots, Quayle was mocked for a speech in which he used the sitcom Murphy Brown as an example of decaying moral values. A month later, during an appearance at an elementary school spelling bee, he infamously added an E to the end of a 12-year-old boy's correct spelling of the word potato.
Yikes.
Not a great look.
Well, yeah, Quayle's missteps on maybe somewhat less substantive policy grounds as some of our previous mentions, but yeah, he was just a shit show.
Yeah, kind of an idiot.
Yeah. Well, it brings us to an honorable mention who was maybe a little bit too smart for his own good. Dick Cheney, who is the only man to be honorably mentioned on both our list of the top 5 best and top 5 worst vice presidents.
That's right, and he's earned his spot on both of them.
He is number 1 on the list of most polarizing vice presidents.
Absolutely.
He was the most powerful and influential vice president in American history, but his influence did not always lead to the best results. He led the charge to invade Iraq, insisting that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda, 2 allegations that were never substantiated. Cheney was criticized for his extremely aggressive stances in the War on Terror, including support for warrantless wiretapping and enhanced interrogation techniques, quote-unquote, that many considered to be torture. Cheney's influence waned in the last few years of the Bush administration, especially after his longtime ally, Donald Rumsfeld, resigned as defense secretary. Cheney himself later conceded that his, quote, clout had been, quote, diminished.
Yeah. That's it. An interesting figure is Dick Cheney.
Yep. And an interesting office is the vice presidency.
Absolutely.
And now you know the top 5 best and the top 5 worst. You know a lot more about the vice presidency than you ever did before.
That's absolutely right. And speaking of interesting, besides winning a Nobel Peace Prize, Charles Dawes is the only vice president in history that actually wrote a song that became a hit. The piece in question was called Melody in A Major, and it was a pretty popular tune back in the day with great violinist Fritz Kreisler recording a version of it. And then in 1958, Tommy Edwards had a hit with it under the title It's All in the Game. So not many politicians can make that claim.
No?
And we'll play out the end of the episode with Charles Dawes' Melody in A Major. For the Dead Presidents Podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.